Welcome to Smart Energy, a podcast where we talk about electrification, home improvement, and clean energy. I'm your host, Andrew Zellner, Editor-in-Chief at OhmConnect.
And I'm your co-host, Kelsey Bourgeois, Senior Editor here at OhmConnect.
OhmConnect is on a mission to rally people to change how and when they use electricity, unlocking clean, affordable, and reliable energy. You can learn more and get paid to conserve energy at ohmconnect.com. Thanks for joining me, Kelsey.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
What's on your mind?
Well, I recorded this intro and the interview in the opposite direction. So I've just finished talking to our guest, I'll tell you more about him later. But we ended on this beautiful note that I just cannot put down now, which is thinking about how each one of us individually may not make a huge impact, but all of us together is everything, right?
That is so true. It's like hard. It's hard as a human to wrap your head around that.
Yes.
I think the first time I really thought about that critically, I think it was like an environmental science class in high school, and the idea of the tragedy of the commons, where like one person littering is not going to ruin the earth, and so like that one person doesn't think about their littering, but like
yes.
If nobody thinks about their littering and everyone is doing it, it becomes a tragedy, especially in these like common like shared spaces.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I think that it's easy to fall into this trap, especially today, because there is so much bad news. There is so many horrible things happening, and the predictions are dire, and it's very scary. And that's all real and true. And if you let those things convince you that your personal actions don't matter, then you have just accepted and chosen to be a part of that demise. And I think that's really sad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so actually I ran into this today a little bit, over, the idea that small actions can like lead up to a big thing.
Yes.
We're getting rid of a dresser. And I was trying to move the dresser by myself. I probably shouldn't have been, but just I've got a cat here at home. He's no help.
Right.
And I needed to get it outside so somebody could like come pick it up, all that sort of stuff. And I couldn't move the dresser. And then I was like, oh man, I'm going to need to call like a friend over here. Everyone's at work. And then I was like, oh, like this dresser has drawers in it. And like, I could remove the drawers. And so like, it was like 6 trips of like bringing drawers outside. And then like the dresser was light enough to move, right? And get it out. And those like small actions ended up moving this dresser outside.
I mean, it's also like that's an example of work smarter, not harder. And that's honestly what it is like this is true in these larger discussions. It came up in the context of the environment and how we use energy, but it's true of all of these things. Of a little bit of thought goes a long way. A little bit of work to change a couple of habits. And this was, it's presented in 2 ways. Because one, it's like individual actions like that. Mm-hmm. You just thought about it, and then you realize I can do this in small pieces, and then it's manageable, and I'm doing the big thing. But there's also that piece over time. So small mm-hmm. habits that we do every day make a huge impact over time. Sometimes I think about my waste, like the things that I throw away. So for example, I make my coffee every morning, my coffee grounds, right? And I know I need to be composting. Nobody judge me. I'm working on it. But coffee grounds, I throw them away. And then I think about 365 of those. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, that hurts, right? If those went into compost and back into my neighborhood where I have these community gardens, it's another example of it would go so far.
And you're only drinking 1 cup of coffee a day, which also like boggles my mind. I'm 3 cups of coffee a day, and we have like a community compost. Like the city of Minneapolis will come pick up our compost every week.
Yes.
And so like I don't feel as bad about that, but it is still like I should probably drink less coffee and waste less.
That is the takeaway. You need to limit your caffeine consumption, and I am the one to help you do it.
So I also think, we talk a lot about home improvement on this podcast, and the like way to like get super discouraged as somebody working on a house or a house project is thinking you need to take this house from where it is today to like HGTV level, like beautiful, as fast as you can.
Right.
And like that, there's like no sustainable way to do that. There's no like, you probably couldn't even get a crew to like focus on it enough to do it. It's going to cost a ton of money. And what is gained in that like rush to like do everything right now? um
It's so true. It
yeah.
also, I think home improvement is a good example of the type of project, particularly if you're doing it yourself, that has real personal, like self, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it has your self-esteem can be like greatly impacted. It's the, right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing. I think I would also equate it with maybe like exercise, where it's very hard to get yourself to do it, and it feels like go from where you are today to where you want to be is a big leap. But part of what makes it rewarding and worth it and valuable is not tomorrow I look like this or tomorrow my house looks like this. It's I learned a new skill.
Mm-hmm.
I demonstrated to myself that I can do a little bit every day. I can show up every day. I can make those promises to myself. I can do new things. You know, this is a lot of what you and I have talked about with home
Yeah.
improvement, as I'm a little bit newer to that particular space. A lot of it is building the courage, and starting with small actions is a great way to build that courage. You know, don't go remodel your bathroom tomorrow. That's not the move. You know, maybe start with a little air sealing,
Mm-hmm.
which is my
Mm-hmm.
level right now.
I also think about the idea of like small actions add up to a big impact. I did a project a few years ago, over probably over a month during the summertime, where like I needed to remove a bunch of concrete and dirt from my basement and then fill it back in with gravel and more concrete. And it was like the thing that was sort of like blocking the rest of the work that I needed to do in my basement as far as like air sealing and all that sort of stuff. It was a
Mm-hmm.
drainage project. You had to keep the basement dry. And it was also, sort of during the height of COVID. And so like nobody was really like work like we couldn't get anyone to come work on it, probably couldn't afford it, didn't want like strangers in our home, and I ended up like renting a 15-ton dumpster and sort of like 2 buckets at a time, like 12 buckets a day. I would remove some stuff, dump it in,
Wow.
bring some stuff, and it's like going up the stairs and out of the dumpster and back. And like I like maxed out my body, after like 30 minutes of that.
Yeah.
Um, but at the end of it, I had, it was probably, closer to like 6 tons of debris in a dumpster and
Wow.
another like 2 tons of concrete and gravel that I'd like brought in the basement. And it like wasn't complicated work. It wasn't like difficult. There was sort of like a stamina component, but like, once you're in the middle of it, like you're just like moving forward a little bit at a time. And even if you can't bring 2 buckets up the stairs, you can bring 1 bucket up the stairs.
Yes.
Um, and it was like it, it was like at the end of it, like I hated it during the time. Like
Sure.
I just was like dirty and sweaty, and it was
Mm-hmm.
middle of July. I had like no clean clothes. It was just like crazy. But at the end of it, it was like, oh man, I like did this thing.
Yes.
It like cost basically no money, just like a dumpster rental.
Yes.
And like my house is like better. We're not getting like water in our basement anymore. I was also like in the best shape of my life for like my canoe trip.
Yes.
That going to the Boundary Waters, like dragging a canoe across a portage was like no big thing at all.
You're like, what canoe?
Yeah.
I'm lifting cement at my house. I mean, that's such a good example, and such a good example of something that during it, it almost sounded like a moving meditation, which I know there are actually religions and thought, there are spiritual practices that sort of encourage you to engage in things like that. And so, whether or not you're spiritual, I think it's worth sort of engaging with things with that level of commitment and that
Mm-hmm.
level, right? And I think there's a way to sort of tie it into your beliefs. Again, you don't have to be religious to think this way, but if it's important to you to keep this planet habitable for yourself and for the next generations, then perhaps a part of your daily practices is your daily habits and the things you do to limit your waste, limit your consumption, make smarter choices. And it doesn't have to be drastic. It really doesn't have to
No.
be drastic, because if all of us are doing a little bit, that is extremely drastic.
Yeah. All of these small actions together added up, it's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. That it came up in the context of VPPs and demand response programs, which is what we offer here, where the consumer, if you are an OhmConnect member and you're engaging in our energy saving events, which we call Ohm hours or auto ohms, you may not even really notice.
Mm-hmm.
It's that small, right? The new thing that we rolled out, which I mentioned in the interview too, is a new TV integration where we're just going to dim your TV a little bit for a certain time. You can say no, but like
Mm-hmm.
it's hardly noticeable. So it's these changes that deployed at the right time and place scale into a huge. I mean, that's the whole purpose of what we're doing, right?
Yeah, I was fascinated to learn how much energy consumption is tied up in the brightness of your TV. Not the fact
Same,
that it's on or off, the fact
right?
that how bright it
Yes,
is super interesting. And you can totally turn down your brightness, especially if
it's
it's
fine.
dark outside, that's also the time when energy consumption peaks, is that dinner time, sun's going down. Yeah, it's kind of nuts.
And it's hardly noticeable. So I guess we're talking about it in two frames. There's your actions, and then there's the automated part of it. But I
Mm-hmm.
think I think the small actions and habits are really where we can make the biggest difference. And part of it is in enrolling in things like this that take the guesswork out of it. And
Mm-hmm.
I really like things that I don't have to think about after I did them. I want to be able to think I want it one and done. I want to be in it, and I want to whatever change, because changing habits is harder. Changing habits is harder.
Yeah.
But it does feel motivating to me. And also there's this sense of community too, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
We I think we are facing an epidemic of loneliness. I think that's borne out in the stats. I think a lot of us can feel that since the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of our lives really changed, and we're having trouble as a society getting back to the pre-COVID times of connectedness. And I think
Mm-hmm.
there's something there in connecting around shared values and ideals. And they can be as simple as, I don't want to have trash on the street. Littering's another good example because it's so visceral, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's so much litter in my neighborhood. My neighborhood also gets together and picks it up together, which is just couldn't be sweeter. You
Yeah.
go make friends and pick up trash together. So there's something there too, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of every, you don't think about walking in the fact of oh, I need to put one foot down and then I put the other foot down.
Mm-hmm.
And but when you're learning to walk, you're thinking about that a little bit, but eventually it becomes a habit and you're walking everywhere. Sometimes you're running. And I feel the idea of saving energy is very similar. You
Yes.
try some things out, you figure out what works for you, you make
Mm-hmm.
it a habit, and enough people do that, and suddenly we're living in a better world. It is that simple, although it is also quite complicated.
Well, it is that simple, and I love when people talk about habits and learning to walk, because the other part of that is when you are learning to walk, you fall just
Mm-hmm.
all day, every day. And I like the idea that as adults, we should be able to adopt that willingness to do things wrong,
Mm-hmm.
because getting it wrong a bunch of times is how you eventually get it right. And I do think it takes some courage to be wrong. maybe you'll hear it in my voice in this interview, but I was nervous to conduct this interview because the person I'm interviewing has so much more expertise than me in the industry. But I thought, one, I can do new things and I can learn things. But two, you have to be willing to get it wrong and sound a little dumb sometimes and not know the right thing, because that's how you learn.
Speaking of our expert, who was it?
John Anderson. I'm so excited to show this one to you guys. So he's our Senior Director of Market Innovation here at OhmConnect. He's employee number 4, and he just had so much to say about the history of OhmConnect, energy markets in general, and what it looks like for the consumer. Really was a lot of what we talked about. So I'm excited for you to hear.
Man, I'm so excited to listen.
Today on the podcast, we have John Anderson. He's our Senior Director of Market Innovation here at OhmConnect. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for your time. We'll jump right in. So the first question I have for you is sort of about your professional and educational background, a little bit of color for how you got here.
Sure. Well, let's start with the educational piece first. I was in school a little longer than most people. I have a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, and a PhD as well. And my journey starts at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Canada, which for folks who may or may not know is really the epicenter of the Canadian energy business. A lot of the big oil companies are based there, electric companies, pipeline companies, you name it. And so there's no escaping the energy ecosystem in Calgary. And it permeates its way into the university and into your classes and into internships and so forth. So that's where I caught the energy bug. And while many of my classmates took jobs in industry after completing their undergrad degrees, I went on to do more grad school in economics, continuing again through getting a PhD, always with an angle towards the energy business, but really unsure about what I wanted to do with myself. I was really on the fence between an academic career and something in industry. At the end of the day, coming from Stanford in the Bay Area, I decided to stay in the region and pursue the industry route and see where that would take me. And I actually took a job post-graduation at Pacific Gas and Electric in San Francisco, which many of you might think, hey, stodgy utility, what was that all about? But really, I was in a group that was working on pretty much all the interesting issues of the day, whether that was cap and trade, renewables, new retail rates, you name it. And it was a fantastic learning environment for someone like myself, who's just a very curious person by nature. So not only did I get up to speed on all the issues, I managed to learn a whole bunch of things from people who are experts in the business that have spent 20 plus years working on how do you plan a transmission system in a large state like California? How do you run a fleet of hydroelectric power plants? And what I started to find was we were doing all these really, really interesting supply side things in California, but not really touching upon the demand side of the market, customers.
Right.
And I also found in this large enterprise, we were talking about customers very abstractly and many degrees removed. We'd say, is this good for our customers? Is this going to benefit customers? And I was hard pressed to answer that question. I don't know. I feel so removed from the typical PG&E customer. And so I started looking around for something that was a little bit different, a smaller company, something that was focused on that demand side of the market, the consumer side, and actually found OhmConnect hiding in plain sight. At the time, it was just a tiny little startup, only 3 other employees, a few public filings here and there that led me onto them. And there was no job posting. I just reached out to the founders and I basically made my case. I said, I think you guys are onto something really interesting and really valuable. I think I can help really make money in the markets with this product you're building on behalf of your customers. And so they put me through the ringer. We had a number of conversations that stretched over a couple of months and managed to carve out a role for myself. And here I am 8.5 years later, still with a company that's grown to a team of about 100 people and now serving hundreds of thousands of customers.
Thank you so much. You have such an interesting background. I'm curious. I want to touch on a few things that you said, but in your PhD, you said both of your master's degrees are in economics. Did you focus on energy in your PhD, or did that start when you moved to PG&E?
No, I started really coming out of my undergrad. So my uh, dissertation research at Stanford was focused on innovation and tax policies in the energy space, with a particular emphasis on the wind business in the United States as well as the shale gas business in Canada. So it predates my time at PG&E and OhmConnect, but really was the foundation for exploring work in that space.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit to OhmConnect. I didn't realize you were employee number 4.
Four, that's right.
That's very exciting. And I mean, obviously, you've stayed here all this time, but I would love to hear more about what those early days were like. Specifically, you were coming in and saying, hey, I think I can make you some money, which of course is music to founders' ears. So they have a good idea. And I want to hear more about what that looked like, what you were proposing at the time, what the early days of OhmConnect meant. A lot of people are familiar with our product now. They have no idea about that story.
Yeah, well, let me come back to the product in just a moment because that's
Okay.
interesting in its own right. But from a business environment, it was definitely the early days of where we find ourselves now. It was really a point in time in which non-utility demand response providers like OhmConnect, non-utility entities that have a role to play in these markets, were just kind of coming into their own. A bunch of changes were underway in California in particular with regard to customer data access, with regard to market mechanisms to allow aggregations of small customers to participate in these big wholesale electric markets in which they'd otherwise be far too small to participate in. And of course, the IoT revolution was really underway. For the first time, people could buy inexpensive internet connected devices like smart thermostats and smart plugs and put them to work in these programs. So all of that was very exciting and really just getting underway. From a product perspective, when I think back 8 years ago to where we were, I think the trap that we fell into is the early folks at OhmConnect were all a bunch of energy nerds, and I'm sorry to say we still are. But the
I'm
mistake we
not
were making,
sorry. I'm happy about it.
the mistake we were making is we were building the product for ourselves. We were building the product
Right.
that people like us and like-minded folks would want to use. And of course, the other energy nerds out there just gobbled this up. They loved it. We were providing all kinds of information, about where your energy is coming from and how it's being used in a home, and all kinds of bells and whistles, and a very, what we thought was a feature-rich and feature-laden and very exciting, very engaging product. And what
Sure.
we didn't realize is this was probably intimidating and off-putting, if not altogether unintelligible to most people. Most people
Right.
were just tuning it out and saying, "Oh, what? I don't know what these nuts are up to, but that's not for me." And so, while we had something that we thought was really, really cool, we were limiting ourselves to a very small segment of the overall population. And that started to change as the team grew, and we realized the need to bring in people from outside of the energy space. So a lot of the hires who came after me came from totally different settings like healthcare, education, banking, gaming, uh,
Mm-hmm.
spaces that are much more consumer centric, or have a better sense, I think, of meeting the customer where they are and tailoring the product to suit their needs. And so, ironically, later versions of OhmConnect's product that followed actually either altogether removed some of those early features or just moved them a little deeper into the experience. They were still there if you were engaged and interested enough in finding them, but most people, again, didn't care. And so they didn't need to be at the front of the experience. We needed to keep it really simple and make the value proposition as clear to people as possible.
That makes a lot of sense, and I can see those pieces in the product, the healthcare, the gaming in particular. You can see kind of how, I mean, that's a lot of what our current product is. It's very
Right.
gamified, it's very fun, which, as you said, much more interesting to those of us who are not deep in the energy sector. So I love to hear that was kind of the thought process, bringing new people on. I want to step aside from OhmConnect a little bit and go back to you. I'm curious about sort of your personal motivations. I know you talked about sort of being steeped in the energy environment from undergrad on, but obviously the other piece of what we're doing is working on climate change and trying to supply clean energy for everyone, right? I'm curious about your connection to that, if that's a big motivator in why you're in this world or not really. What does that look like for you?
It certainly is now, but I think I'd be lying to you if I said early on that was at the foremost of my mind. I've certainly always cared about the environment. I like clean air. I like clean water. I like,
Who
being
doesn't?
outdoors. Who doesn't?
Mm-hmm.
And, if I'm looking at pollution staring me in the face, that's not something I like. That's something I'd like to try to change. More broadly, zooming out a bit, I think I've always been interested in trying to, eliminate waste, simplify processes, make things more efficient. And that's probably what drew me to this space is a sentiment that there must be a better way or a different way of doing things. And so that led me to the research I was doing as a grad student in the wind business, for instance. That led me into being interested in these big, complicated problems at PG&E. And as I said, finding a way to engage the demand side of the electricity market that has for so long just been overlooked or thought of as an afterthought. So I think that's really where I started to get a toehold. And as I've grown older, as my horizon on which I plan gets a little bit longer, as I've become a parent and have young kids, certainly that's motivated me to think harder as well about the big picture and the long term and issues like climate change and how we can directly impact those.
Very nice, very nice. So, all right, let's go a little bit back into the product. Some of our listeners are energy nerds like yourself, and some of them are people like me, relatively new to the industry, relatively new to this product. So I'd love it if you could just give me like a top level simplified explanation of two terms that we talk about all the time here on the podcast and at OhmConnect, which is VPPs and demand response. We'll start with VPPs. If you could just sort of simply explain that for people, that would be very helpful.
Sure, and I think it's actually easier to address them in the other order.
Go ahead.
Or maybe even taking a quick step back.
Yes.
As I've alluded to, traditionally the way the electric system has been run is the demand side is just kind of going to do what it's going to do. And we've met this inflexible demand by moving around supply resources. So power plants turn on and turn off. They move up, they move down, and they would meet demand that would change over the course of the day, but usually in a fairly predictable fashion. We're really moving now to a world in which we need to now move demand to meet a somewhat predictable but inflexible supply. With more and more renewables like wind and like solar, we need to change when we're using energy to align with those periods of production. And so demand response is not something new. It's simply been a tool in the grid operator's toolkit for all these years that says, as an alternative to turning on generating resources or moving around generating resources, we can turn off or move around demand side resources. For the longest time, however, this was really the domain of large electricity customers. So not households, but big factories or other commercial and industrial facilities. And as I said earlier, it was also really the exclusive domain of the incumbent electric utilities. And there wasn't a big role for independent entities like OhmConnect in these markets. So that has changed to enable more actors to participate in this space. But when people talk about demand response, usually they mean controlled responses that occur a handful of times a year, typically during peak grid conditions, maybe on a hot summer day when the grid is stressed. Everybody's running their air conditioning. The grid operator is worried about blackouts, and they will call upon customers, in particular those large customers, to shut down their facilities and thereby alleviate that stress on the grid. Now we're moving to a world where we don't need only that kind of capability, but we really need a day-to-day capability that could be provided by demand resources. Can they move around electricity a little bit here, a little bit there, not only to ensure the grid runs reliably, but to capitalize on those clean energy resources and to run the system at the lowest overall cost? And so this can be done, as you can imagine, not just by large customers, but by small customers, in particular those that have adopted technology in their homes, maybe not for the purpose of controlling energy, but for some totally different reason. Water heaters so they can have hot water, electric vehicles so they can get around from point A to point B, or air conditioning so they can keep cool in the summertime. These things can be controlled little by little across thousands and thousands of households to provide a response that in aggregate looks to the grid operator more or less the same as a power plant putting energy onto the system.
It's so interesting. So I would love to dig in a little bit further to the piece about the cost. You talked about the reason to move around that energy and or to avoid turning on plants or moving things around is cost. But I think that cost that's financial, but there's also sort of a environmental cost. And right now, can you talk a little bit about how those two things are lining up, both our environmental objectives and our cost objectives in the market?
Yeah, as we were talking about a moment ago, energy from renewable resources like wind and solar is very low cost energy. The challenge sometimes is the wind blows at nighttime, or the sun is brightest in the middle of the day when there may not be the greatest demand for electricity. And so if we can take measures either through technological means or through market means to try to better align usage with these periods of abundant supply, that can be very, very impactful on the overall costs of meeting need. And I think one thing that's really important to recognize is people don't use electricity for the sake of using electricity. It's a means to an end, right? We use electricity to charge our electric vehicles so we can drive from point A to B, or we use electricity to heat water so that we can have warm showers and wash our clothes. Although I think on other podcasts you've said we maybe don't need hot water to do that.
Not for most things, but
or we use electricity to cool our homes on a hot day or heat them on a cold day. And oftentimes that energy use does not need to exactly coincide with the time that we want that service. You know, I can heat the water in my water tank a couple of hours before I take a hot shower. I can charge my car in the dead of night, even if I don't need to drive it until sometime the next day. And so these are some of the things that, again, price signals in the form of the programs that we're operationalizing as a VPP provider or through the retail rates that customers can now sign up with utilities or other providers around the country help to bring about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's worth for listeners just to think through. As you said, we're not using electricity just for fun, for no reason. It's for practical purposes. And some of what needs to happen right now is perhaps a shift in how we think about it, and this education of, do I need to do that right now? And as you gave such a good example with the water heater, that can be done at other times and it will still be readily available for you when you want it. So there isn't necessarily a massive inconvenience associated with it. I think when people first hear about this, they get nervous about, oh, what if I'm not going to have the electricity? But practically in people's homes, these are really minor sort of things, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and that's certainly the future that we're marching towards. There's always been a trade-off, or at least a perceived trade-off, between the value that you can receive either as earnings or savings from participating in a program like OhmConnect, and the effort you need to put in order to get those earnings in terms of changing how and when you use energy. And people naturally are going to ask themselves, is the juice worth the squeeze?
Yeah.
One of the things that has always really surprised us at OhmConnect is that more often than not, people seem to enjoy participating in these events. They do put in the effort to reduce their energy use, and they enjoy the gamification, as you mentioned. They enjoy the challenge. They enjoy the competition. But we want to continue to make that easier and easier and easier for people so that it just becomes a no-brainer, and that you don't have to lift a finger and you don't have to compromise your comfort. That your home can be on autopilot. It can take the set of actions you want it to take, again, to save or earn your money while maintaining a certain comfort level, while providing a meaningful response to the grid that's good for reliability as well as the environment.
Absolutely. That's that IoT, that Internet of Things. As our devices get smarter, this stuff, we can have it happening in the background, because that's the other piece of it. Not only the inconvenience, but is this going to take a lot of effort? And it depends on how you're enrolled with a program like OhmConnect. But if you have things just automatically set up, it takes no effort from you. You do nothing, and you will save money and earn rewards. So it makes it really seamless. Which is just another plug for more smart devices, I guess. Okay, so I think you define both demand response and VPPs pretty well. Is there anything else you want to say for someone who's really new to thinking about those ideas?
I think we're at a tipping point where this is going to become more commonplace and more common knowledge to a lot of people. And an example I like to use is gasoline prices. If you go around any big city and ask people, I would bet you that most of them have a pretty good sense of what the gas price is right now. And not only that, they could tell you, is that a normal price for this time of year? Is it high? Is it low? Has it been moving up? Has it been moving down? They could also tell you, how prices change seasonally from summer to spring to winter, and in response to holidays and so forth. I feel like we're going to have a similar paradigm emerge as EVs become more and more prominent. That people will have a more clear sense of what is the price per kilowatt hour and how does it change over the course of the day or the course of the week or the time of year. And I wouldn't be surprised if before long apps like Gas Buddy start showing you charging prices in your neighborhood as well. So I think as people develop that kind of knowledge, that kind of intuition, that will spill over into other parts of their life. They'll start to get a sense of, what energy costs, again, why the cost changes over the course of the day, and if they can adjust their EV charging behavior in response to that, it's pretty natural to extend that thinking to the other big uses of electricity in your life. So again, your heating, your cooling, your water heating, maybe you have a swimming pool and a pump attached to that pool.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And I know we're anticipating, right now, a lot of people in California are on time of use plans, some places in the rest of the country, but we anticipate that becoming more and more common time of use rates across the country. Is that right?
I think so. And again, as people gain knowledge about how those rates work and why they're designed that way, and become more knowledgeable and adopt more tools within their home to manage those rates, it's going to save them money, and it's not going to require a great deal of effort on their part. It doesn't need to be something that's scary. It can be something that you can lean into and either earn or save money.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of these things are, you said demand responses is a relatively old idea, but VPPs, can you tell me a little bit about the history, how new that idea is, how new it is at scale, what that looks like?
It's a term that I've only really started to hear in the last couple of years. And again, I think what's fundamentally different about what we think about as VPPs and traditional demand response is the frequency with the VPP will be utilized. So on a daily basis, perhaps, rather than a couple of times per year.
Right.
The precision with which it may be called upon to provide a response. So instead of a big drastic binary action like shutting down an entire factory production line for a day, it might be turning off or on a handful of EV chargers or batteries for perhaps only a matter of minutes. And just the scale of participation. So again, instead of a small number of large facilities, we could envision this being a large number of small customers. That's fundamentally the difference in the evolution.
That makes sense. So a large number of small customers, you said. And I'm curious, as you're talking about those minute, maybe it's a few minutes, this battery goes on, this goes off, whatever it is. It's very targeted, and I'm imagining that equates to efficiency. So I'm curious what you think about, and this could be our company, everybody doing demand response. What do we do well in terms of efficiency? What are we getting? How close are we to that minute thing, and where is there room for improvement?
Well, certainly one of the growth areas for us over the past few years has been how do we manage all of these interconnected devices at scale? It is a real challenge. It's a non-trivial challenge, and maybe a good topic for a future podcast. We are talking about a future in which we may have hundreds of thousands or millions of connected households, and each household may have 5, 10, 15, 20 different devices in the home that we want to connect. And so how do we issue instructions to all of those devices to get them to take the desired response, to get data back from them confirming that they're doing what we expect them to do, or even providing us with measurements validating performance in real time. That is a big computational undertaking. And part of the scary part is it's not completely within OhmConnect's control. We work with a large ecosystem of device manufacturers that in many cases place some rules on how we're allowed to control their devices, in large part in the interest of making sure the end customer is having a positive experience. As you can imagine, they don't want us necessarily toggling a device on and off in a way that could provide a poor customer experience or even damage the device. So we need to find the right middle ground that makes everybody happy. The good news is that a lot of these device manufacturers are coming around to the notion that there is value to be realized from putting these things to work in the energy markets. There is value that can be shared between OhmConnect, the customer, and the device manufacturer. That is changing the way they think about this process and really changing the value proposition to customers. Because as I said earlier, a lot of people, most people arguably, aren't buying a device so that they can put it to work in a VPP program. They're buying it for some other reason. They're buying it to provide comfort or convenience in their home, or just because of the cool factor. And oh, by the way, guess what else you can do with it?
Right.
Put it to work in a program like OhmConnect. So when you put those pieces together, it's leading to some real meaningful growth at scale, but still challenges to be worked out.
Yeah, I mean, as you can tell, this is just a massive technical challenge, and I'm very impressed with everyone who works on it at our company. A good example of that, I learned this week that I have a smart TV. I didn't even realize that my TV was quote unquote smart and could be connected in this way, but we have this new partnership with LG that I'm involved in testing, and this is such a good example of an end user is barely going to notice this, because all that's going to happen is we're going to dim the TV a little bit, because what takes a lot of energy is that light, and it's hardly anything. And also you can always opt out if you're watching something that you just must have the full brightness on for some reason or whatever. But it's such a good example of something that you wouldn't notice, but I'm going to save money. I'm going to earn rewards from OhmConnect. It's like a no-brainer. So as you said, that secondary benefit.
Yeah, and I'll just pile on there for a second, because thinking back to the early days of OhmConnect, to the extent that we had devices in the ecosystem, the responses were rather limited or rather binary. So your thermostat, it turns off. Your smart plug turns off. Your lights turn off. Your TV turns off. And depending on what the customer is doing in his or her home, depending on the time of day or the time of year it is, that might not be a consideration at all, or it could be a terrible inconvenience, right? Being left in the dark, in the cold, with nothing to do because you can't turn on your TV isn't the greatest experience. But, I can still go about cooking dinner or cleaning up the kitchen with my lights at half of their brightness. Yes. As you were saying, you can still watch your show on TV. People, as I'll add as a little aside, one of the things that irritates our customer support team the most is when people's TVs turn off during the middle of a big sports game. So imagine, instead of shutting you off, in Game 7 of the World Series, we just dim the light a little bit and you barely even notice, if you notice at all.
Right.
So providing a response that's on a continuum rather than, a 0-1 on-off response is a big and really important evolution that is going to get more acceptance from customers and from the device manufacturers as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I had another toggle on off funny thing. I have a walking treadmill under my desk, and I put it on a smart plug. And then there was a
guess what happened.
It stopped, and I did not expect it. It was not so, but that led me to a post we have coming that's going to be like good candidates for for smart plugs and bad candidates, because they're good candidates and not for that particular technology. Right. But the bigger integrations, as you said, they're going to be on a spectrum, which is going to be a better user experience. All right, so I'm curious about sort of projecting into the future, which I know that you can do. So tell me, how do you see demand response changing in the coming years, either as relates to OhmConnect or the energy market in general?
Yeah, I think, as we've been talking about, really the big change is this continued progression from demand response as a once every now and then contributor to grid reliability, to something that's really there each and every day, and helping to maintain a reliable and low cost and clean system by shifting and shedding electric demand on a day-to-day basis. There's a number of different ways that can be operationalized, but I think the key theme is really one of automation. And as we've been discussing, finding a way to make that automation as imperceptible as possible to customers so that they don't feel like they're sacrificing anything in order to realize the benefits of their devices and their homes participating in these VPPs. So the work is underway. We're starting to round that corner, but there's still a lot to do to get from here to there.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I keep hearing. Yeah, devices. I can see why it's so important. And it's been fun to make my own home a little smarter. I'm curious, sort of as an aside, how smart is your home?
My home is quasi smart, I would say. I have I just found out as well a TV like you do that can provide a more sophisticated response than I had thought. I live in a climate where it's not terribly hot. We don't have air conditioning, and I bought my house only a couple of years ago with, unfortunately, some very new but still dumb appliances, if you want to say that.
Oh no.
For better or for worse, I have a very new and very efficient natural gas furnace. I also have a fairly new electric resistive water heater. And the reason I mention all this is one of the challenges I think we face in bringing about smart homes is a lot of these appliances are lumpy purchases, to use a term from economics. You don't buy a new water heater very often. Maybe it's once every 10 or 15 years. And if you think about it, when do you buy a new water heater? It's not something you sit around and plan for.
In a panic.
In an absolute panic. You wake up one morning to have a shower and rusty sludge starts coming out of the bathtub. And you say, I need a new water heater and I need one now.
Yes.
And guess what? You call up the plumber. What's the plumber going to do? Is he going to say, hey, you know what? There's this new state-of-the-art one from Germany that you can connect to the internet. It costs twice as much, and it'll be here in 3 weeks. I actually don't know how to hook it up, but my friend does, but he's booked for the next 2 months. So you'll have hot showers again sometime, by summer. Instead, the person's going to go to Home Depot. They're going to buy the one that's on the shelf, the one that they know how to hook up. And the good news is you have hot water again. The bad news is probably not going to need a new water heater for another 10 or 15 years. We've kind of lost you that time around.
Right.
And so this is the problem that OhmConnect and governments and equipment manufacturers need to figure out. How do you give people a strong incentive to swap out their devices for more efficient and controllable ones that can participate in these VPPs of the future? And how do you make sure that they're on the shelves in your local store and that installers know about their benefits, that they're not going to have a larger upfront cost to customers, and that if you need one in a pinch, you can get it, that we can capitalize on that opportunity to upgrade your home?
Yeah, I think you've absolutely laid out the problem correctly. And we have, a couple of things that are going to help somewhat, right? The IRA is a big one. Especially if you're sort of nearing the end of your water heater, is a great example of the life of its warranty. It's good to start doing that thinking now. And there are tax rebates and incentives to get these more efficient appliances. So right now in this acute moment, there are incentives, but that still takes some planning and it still takes some knowledge, which is, hopefully also where we're coming in, sharing with people, hey, you should be thinking about your water heater before you're in a panic.
That's right.
And then the other side of that, of the jobs part of, like you said, your plumber may not know how to hook up a heat pump water heater, which would be fair. It's, a relatively new technology. So training enough people in the trades to be able to install the amount that we need. And we're seeing some money in that, in the IRA as well. So some small solutions, but it's a larger problem that we haven't quite cracked yet.
Absolutely.
Great. So I want to move on a little bit to, we've talked a lot about consumers, regular people in this, but how educated do you think a regular person needs to be? You've talked about how you think that's going to happen naturally, but what is the threshold for you of how aware someone needs to be sort of doing their part in this effort?
Yeah, I think we can't expect people to, swerve out of their lanes to go and figure this stuff out. I mean, there's a lot going on in people's lives, and the last thing they need is something else competing for their energy and their attention. So I think, as OhmConnect has progressed from something that was geared towards energy nerds to something that's as simple and right to the point as possible, is a big step in the right direction. It's possible I'm not the first person to tell this story, but years ago at OhmConnect, we did a focus group where we had a customer who asked us at the end of the focus group, "What's a qua?" And we all looked at each other and said, "What? What are you talking about? What's a qua?" I'm like, "Qua, a qua, KWH. It's all over your website." And we had this aha moment and just said, "Okay, so this is, indicative of the baseline level of knowledge for a lot of people, and you can't fault them for that. Again, it's not their responsibility to go and figure all this stuff out. Again, there's a million things competing for their time and attention." So that was a very enlightening moment. And I tell that story to people who work at utilities or electric grid operators or state and federal governments that, again, are so steeped in this ecosystem that they can't remember what it's like to not have that knowledge. And if you can be self-aware enough to recognize how most people approach this, how most people think about it, then it really gives you a good starting point to think about solutions. So I mentioned earlier, I really do feel like there's something on the horizon with EVs, that the horse has left the barn when it comes to EVs, and that even absent continued policy assistance, there's enough momentum behind EVs that we are going to see continued growth. And not just in places like California, where there's been a great deal of policy incentives to support EVs and just a political mindset that cultivates EV growth. But my in-laws, for instance, live in the Midwest, and now I hear them talking about buying electric pickup trucks, for instance, and kind of doing the math about, how much would it cost me? Where would I charge it? How far can I drive? What can I tow?
Yeah.
And that's why I think, vehicles like the F-150 Lightning are just bellwethers, right? If they can be successful, it's marks a point of no return. And so when that happens, again, that same mindset around gasoline prices will very likely emerge in the electricity space. People will have a frame of reference as to what's a normal price. How does the price change over the course of the day or the week or the year? Am I getting a good deal, a bad deal? What's it going to cost me to drive from here to there? And then the rest follows very naturally from there. So I'm very optimistic that we're on the cusp of that transition, and that level setting of knowledge will make things easier for a lot of people.
I think you're absolutely right. Whenever I don't have an EV yet myself, I'm gonna let my combustion engine die and then make the trade. But I do, Andrew knows exactly the kilowatt hour that he charges at. He, as we've talked about here. So I think you're right. That's gonna go a long way. I'm curious about, you talked about EVs. You said the horses left the barn. We're on our way. That's happening. The other part of EVs is that it's just a tremendous amount of energy that are going to be in home, that's going to be going through homes and stored in homes that has never been before, right? I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about, and maybe this is not a question for you, so you can pass if you want, but sort of EV batteries as storage and being able to use that in the same way.
Yeah, and you just reminded me, I missed a real opportunity for a good energy joke. Could have said the horseless carriage has left the barn, but next time. You've just touched upon an area that is just fascinating to me, and that is the notion of electric vehicles as these, batteries on wheels. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is the battery capacity of a typical EV dwarfs the battery capacity of the Tesla Powerwall systems and other battery systems that some people are putting on their homes. In some cases, the battery capacity of your vehicle is 3, 4, 5, 6 times or more what
and
people are installing in their homes. That's right. That's wow. Right. It's enormous. It's tremendous. And I think there's at least 2 or 3 things that need to happen in order to really enable that to be a viable grid resource. The first is we need charging infrastructure that is bidirectional. So not only does it allow you to pull energy off the grid to charge the battery, it allows you to take energy from the battery and put it back onto the grid. We're very close, I think, to having that. It's a combination of charging infrastructure as well as the vehicles themselves needing either hardware or software capabilities to enable that, and to do so in a way that doesn't jeopardize the longevity of the vehicle or the driving performance of the vehicle. Right. But based on the conversations I've had with folks that work in the EV space, that seems to be a very manageable set of challenges.
Really? Okay.
The other thing I'll say we need is just policies that allow for these types of resources to connect to the grid and monetize that capability, that allow you to give your energy back to the grid and be compensated for that energy at a rate that's reflective of the market need at any point in time. We're getting there in some places, but there's more work to be done. And then there's just a challenge, a mindset challenge, I guess, for EV owners. Your vehicle needs to be physically connected with current technology to the grid in order to, enable this bidirectional capability. So that might mean every single day when you come home from work or running your errands or whatever you do with your day, plugging that cable into your vehicle. Having a full charge sitting in your driveway doesn't do much good if there's no means of putting that energy back onto the grid. You need to plug that wire in. For many drivers, that might already be a habit. For others, it's not a habit, or it's not possible because they live perhaps in a multifamily building where they don't have access to their own charging.
Right.
So these are challenges that are a combination of policy and technology, but I just see such tremendous potential. The fact that we have, so much stored energy on wheels, and that most people, they don't drive a full battery worth of driving in any given day. They have a lot of flexibility to be able to provide that energy or some of that energy back to the grid, especially if they're compensated at a high rate for it.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew and I have been talking about net metering, of course, so that's what's making me, think of. But yeah, I'm excited to hear that you are very optimistic about that, and that the people that you are talking to are saying this, we're going to be able to do this. It's just a matter of time and technology and policy. So, yeah, great. Well, I think we could probably wrap up. Is there any one thing that you want someone who listened to this podcast to walk away with? Anything you want to reiterate, or anything you didn't say that you'd like to say?
I think it's just that small actions can have a big impact in numbers. And that can mean a number of things. It could mean when we have ohm hours, even taking little steps within your home to save energy or reduce energy. When you think about the fact that it's not just you doing that, but it's you and hundreds of thousands of other people. Each of those drops in the bucket adds up to an awful lot of water. So keep that in mind. But also taking recurring small actions, on a day-to-day basis can add up to big energy savings within your home. And so it's easy, amid all the bad news we hear about climate change and energy bills and so forth, to feel helpless and powerless, and like you as an individual can't do anything. But remember, you're not the only one who is trying to help, who's trying to drive change. And when you team up with many, many other like-minded people, some pretty incredible things are possible.
That is such a lovely note to end on. I don't even want to say anything else. You can make a change by being a part of other people who want to make a change. That's beautiful.
100%.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, John. I really appreciate it, and I'll let you go.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So every week on our podcast, we take a listener question. This week, our listener question is from Tracy. So Tracy says, it's getting cold here in the Intermountain West. We're thinking about adding some insulation to our attic. What type of insulation should we be adding?
First of all, kudos to Tracy for wanting to add insulation to the attic. This is a great question, and I think it's also you need a little bit of background on insulating attics. And actually, if you're in an older home, say something not built within the last 10 or 20 years, really the first thing you should do before you add more insulation is make sure your attic is well air sealed. And so what I mean by that is, your attic is typically unconditioned space. So it should be outside of your building envelope. But when you're building a house, you're doing things like drilling some holes for lights in your ceiling under that attic, or running wires through studs. Oftentimes, where like your exterior walls meet your roof line, there's not a ton of space there for insulation. Um, and so you want to make sure you go through and you air seal really well. You can do that with your existing insulation in there. But what is often recommended, especially if you don't have a ton of insulation in your roof already, is to actually vacuum out all that insulation. There's something called an insulation vacuum, which, fantastic name, whoever branded that. Got
really
it right.
knew what they were doing. Yeah.
But it's this machine with like 100-foot long hose. So the machine sits on the ground. It has like a giant bag attached to it, a giant canvas bag with 100-foot hose. And you just like open your attic, mask up, probably wear some clothes you don't mind getting dirty, and you like vacuum out all the insulation, and then you can see kind of like the entire attic. You can identify the spots where like air might be leaking in. It's easier to do the air sealing without any insulation in your attic.
That makes sense, because to be able to see, because you need to be able to, one, feel the air potentially going through, but also another way to do that is just see what light is coming through in the various
if you can see light,
corners.
Air can get through for sure.
Right. Okay, so air seal. So first would be to air seal the space before you even consider adding insulation. So maybe pull out, if there's like bad insulation, not great insulation, pull it out, do air sealing. That's not that hard. It's not that expensive to do. Yeah,
it's like difficult work to do, but just because it's like dusty and uncomfortable, and it's not like complicated work.
It's not technically difficult. It's just annoying.
Yes. Like most home improvement projects.
Yeah.
So once you have sufficiently air sealed your attic, then you want to, insulate it back as much as you can. In an unconditioned attic, most homes in the United States have unconditioned attics. And the way attics work is that air comes in under your eaves and is allowed to like exit either at your ridge or at your gable ends. So the ridge is like the center of the roof. There's usually a vent there, or on older houses like mine, I have like louvered window things on both ends of my house. And so that is meant for your attic to be part of the unconditioned space, and to stay cool, all those sorts of things. So you want to make sure you don't block those soffit vents. You usually there are like products out there that like keep a channel of air allowed to come up, so you can insulate like kind of right against that channel.
But that's really important to keep those open.
That's super important. And then the last thing you do is you add your insulation. In the world of carbon footprints, the best insulation you can use right now that's widely available is something called cellulose insulation. It's like literally shredded newspaper and like cotton. It's treated with a fire retardant. And it's cheap. It has a super low carbon footprint. And you can rent a machine from Home Depot. They often give it to you for free if you buy enough of this insulation. And again, it's a giant hose, and you just blow it into your attic.
Which that sounds like a fun project to me.
That is like a super fun project.
That's a fun project.
It's less fun to be the person like loading the machine, because
sure.
You have to like be throwing bales of insulation in.
But once you're doing it, and I'm reading here in a recent blog post, it has a pretty good R value, which is, maybe you were going to talk about this next.
Yeah,
but
so
R value is the insulation value.
So you want to make sure you have enough R value for your climate, and roofs, in most of the United States, somewhere between R48 and R60 are sort of the new building codes. And with cellulose insulation, that's like 12 to like 16 inches, depending on how much you're able to like pack it in.
Right.
I will say this is something you only want to have to do once. And so it's like making sure you got the air sealing right, making sure you like are not blocking your vents, your venting, and then blowing in enough insulation. It's okay to blow in more. This insulation is really, really cheap, all things said and done, and you'll likely recover the costs of your insulating the like hard costs of how much your insulation cost and like machine rental, all that sort of stuff within like the first or second year of doing this in your home.
That's really fast for a home improvement project. Yeah. So that I mean, right there, that's like you said, you do it once, you recoup your costs within a year or two, and then it's done.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll add about cellulose insulation, the other way we evaluate sort of the carbon footprint of these things is the GWP, the global warming potential. Mm-hmm. It's negative for this because it's reused materials. So that's why Andrew is explaining that, like, if you can choose, if you can get this is the move.
Yeah. Other common insulation types you'll see are fiberglass. So those are like the pink and yellow bats. Usually, they also make it in a form you can blow it into your attic. If you can't get cellulose, fiberglass is also an okay way to do this. If you have enough space in your attic, working with bats is sometimes easier too. They also make mineral wool insulation, which is also glass fiber. It uses a waste product from, I think, steel manufacturing.
Yes.
To make it. That's less environmentally friendly, but still like the offset of like using less heating sort of makes it worthwhile.
Right. So all these are going to be beneficial for the environment, but you do want to look at the GWP on those. But the other thing I'll say, these are all either treated or naturally fireproof, and also insect repellent, which is the other big thing you want in your insulation. You don't want to be attracting pests. So.
One other kind of insulation I'm super stoked about.
Tell us.
So it's wood fiber insulation. It's very commonly used in Europe. The first domestic manufacturer, they're called Timber HP. They opened in Maine like last year. They just started producing insulation in the blowable form. They also will be making it in bat form and sort of like sheet form. And the sheets are really cool because you can also use those to add insulation to the exterior of your house or the exterior of your roof. That's a little bit more involved building science wise. So for most folks looking at insulating homes with vented attics, blown in cellulose is the way to go. It's one of the most inexpensive. It's like not very hazardous for the people doing it. It's a waste product. And ultimately it'll make your house more comfortable, which it's like a win-win-win-win.
Double win, extra, triple, quadruple win.
Yeah,
absolutely. And the other thing I'll say about wood fiber insulation, the cellulose is negative 2.16 GWP, and wood fiber is negative 7.13. So it's if you can get that, but as you said, that's a newer product, and it's a newer product,
pricier, and it's probably best reserved for a new build where you can buy it in a large enough quantity that it makes economic sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, that was a very thorough answer, but now you're set up, Tracy, because we just gave you the 3 steps: air seal, check that the vents are open, and then go for it, insulate.
Yeah. Well, that's it for this episode of Smart Energy. Special thanks to John for taking some time to chat, Tracy for sending in a question and letting me ramble on about insulation. To see the show notes and feedback and learn more about Smart Energy, visit ohmconnect.com/smartenergy. Stay safe, conserve some energy, and we'll see you next time.